Today we are going to take a look at what I would regard as being the holy trinity of heavy-duty fixings. We've got concrete screws, wall bolts, resin anchors. In what sort of situations would you use each of them? I wouldn't regard any of them as being the best as such, because there are different scenarios where one is preferred over the other, and I'm going to try and explain that today. Hi folks, and welcome back to the show. As I say, I want to explain in what scenarios I would use each of these fixings, because they are all phenomenally strong fixings, way exceeding anything I can ever test. Theoretically, the resin fixings are probably the strongest, but as you'll see when we talk about the loadings and all that sort of thing, they're all so incredibly strong that it really doesn't make that much difference unless you're using them in a kind of engineering capacity, in which case you refer back to your structural engineer who will design things accordingly and tell you exactly what fixings to use and how to use them. But I'm kind of talking from more of a DIY perspective. What would I use in different scenarios, and what are the pros and cons of all of them? So in order to explain this a little bit better, I've put together a bit of a spreadsheet, and I'll put a link in the description to an article that has this kind of spreadsheet thing in it, and if you want to have a download and have a play with it, it just means you don't have to remember literally everything I'm telling you in this video. But as I say, there is no kind of wrong and right answer as to what is the best fixing to use. They're all appropriate for different scenarios, otherwise they wouldn't exist. So to try and keep things as simple as possible, because I can't go into like 1,000 different types of fixings, I'm just going to be looking at some fairly typical sized fixings here, but obviously bear in mind that everything comes in different sizes, different flavors, from relatively small concrete screws to great big ones that are very expensive. Same goes for wall bolts. They're available in a whole range of sizes and configurations. And obviously in terms of resin fixings, well, it's whatever you're going to shove in the hole, whether it's a piece of rebar or threaded rod or whatever you're going to be using. So we'll start off with the concrete screws. As I say, available in a whole load of different flavors. I've actually got a video coming up where I'm using these for an actual project, and I'll give you a few real life tips of the sort of problems that you can run into. But in terms of a very heavy duty general purpose fixing, concrete screws are absolutely awesome. They sometimes get called tapcon fixings, tapcon connectors, tapcon screws, that sort of thing, because they literally tap the concrete or the brick or whatever you're putting them into. All you need to do is drill a pilot hole. It tells you on the packet what size pilot hole to drill, and then they self-tap into the substrate. So in terms of ease of use, very easy to use. Probably the main problem that you're going to run into with tapcons is that often as you're screwing the bolt or the screw into the concrete, as it drills its own thread, the dust can kind of fall down to the bottom of the hole, and it can end up blocking the hole, and it'll often bottom out before it actually gets tight. So all I would say is, like, try and drill the hole a little bit deeper than you think is necessary. Sometimes you'll have to screw it in and then take it back out again, and maybe drill the hole a little bit deeper and then try again until you're getting a secure fixing. As I say, I'll come on to that on a separate video. Preparation time, very, very quick. All you do is drill the hole, and then you can use an impact driver or a wrench or whatever to actually fasten the fixing in. The loading time is immediate. You're not waiting on any resins to set or anything like that. It's not particularly messy other than the dust from drilling. In terms of failure risk, well, probably the main problem that you're going to run into on walls where you can't necessarily see the substrate. So for example, if you've got a wall that's covered in plaster, you might end up hitting the mortar line or the edge of a brick or whatever. And if you hit a mortar line with this, they are absolutely useless, because the mortar almost certainly isn't going to be strong enough to take any significant load. But if you can see the substrate you're going into, and you know you're not going into the mortar line, you're probably going to get a pretty decent fixing. The cost of these is probably the lowest out of everything. Based on roll plug concrete screws, 12.5mm by 140mm, you're looking at about £8.47 for 5 fixings. They are technically removable, but every time you take it out and put it back in, take it out, put it back in, every time you do that, it's damaging the thread of the concrete, if you like. But as long as you don't go overboard with taking it out and putting it back in too many times, so to speak, then generally you're going to be fine. You can also potentially use them for close edge applications as well. So if you're near the edge of a wall, it doesn't expand the brick or block too much because it's more cutting a thread into the material. So as long as you don't go too close to the edge, I would never recommend going too close to the edge of a brick or block anyway, you should be fine, but do be careful. You can also use it for through fixings, which is a really important thing. I'm going to refer to through fixings a few times today, so it's an important concept that you get your head around. But in a situation, for example, where you're attaching a massive ledger board onto a wall, or perhaps a big ledger board for a lean-to roof, and imagine we've got loads of pre-drilled holes in this bit of wood at like 400mm centres or whatever, all the way along. It's generally not practical with a big bit of wood like that to try and pre-mark all the holes and then take the board down and then drill your wall and then put the board back up and hope that all your holes are going to be in line. It's a really tricky thing to do. What I would generally do is attach one side and then get a spirit level out, make sure everything's level, attach the other side through, and then I would drill through for all the remaining connectors, because that guarantees they're going to be in the right place. It's a much faster and more accurate way of doing things, and with concrete screws that can be done. You can't do that with wall bolts. I'll explain why in a minute. Then we briefly talked earlier about unpredictable substrates, so if you accidentally go into a mortar line, no, it doesn't handle that very well at all. So if you don't know what you're going into, concrete screws probably aren't the best option. Then we've got our friends the wall bolts. I've already made a video about how I would generally use these. In terms of ease of use, they're a little bit harder to use than concrete screws, nowhere near as tricky to use as resin. I'll explain some of the problems that you can run into in a minute. In terms of preparation time, it's really quick. You just drill a hole. The hole obviously needs to be as wide as the overall kind of barrel. So for example, an M12 bolt that we've got here, maybe closer to 20mm. Anyway, it generally says on the instructions what size hole it's going to need. So that is, I suppose, a bit of a disadvantage, that you are going to have to drill much bigger holes into the substrate for wall bolts. Loading time is obviously immediate, you're not waiting on anything to set, not particularly messy. And then we got onto failure risk, and really this is one of the key reasons that I like these, because the failure risk is pretty low. Even if you do hit a mortar line, and I would never advise deliberately attaching into a mortar line for anything important, but sometimes it's just simply unavoidable. But if you do catch the edge of a brick or block and you end up going into the mortar line, it's probably still going to work, because the way that these work is entirely by friction, where the more that you tighten this up, this little conical feature at the end kind of forces its way up the thread and it makes it expand into the substrate. And it really, honestly, once these are tight, they're so hard to get out. If you do want to get the fixing back out, by the way, what you need to do is kind of loosen it a bit, and then you have to kind of hammer the fixing in so that this bit pops out, but then often what will happen, the whole thing can fall to bits, which is a bit of a disadvantage with these, is that they're a little bit more sensitive because you've got more moving parts. You've got the conical bit at the end there, you've got the main expanding section, you've got a spring kind of arrangement in the middle holding it all together, and then you've got this collar at the end that can fall off as well sometimes. So, you know, it's not uncommon on an actual job site where you end up having to like put them back together when they fall to bits. That can be quite annoying, especially if you've got very cold fingers at the time. General cost of these is a little bit more expensive than the concrete screws. You're looking at about £12.59 for 5 of them, based on really heavy duty ones. That's based on the roll plug M12 by 140mm, which I think is these ones. They are kind of removable. Obviously, you can take this bit out as much as you want, which is kind of nice because you're going into a threaded section. But once you do get this out, what will often happen is that the rest of it gets stuck in the wall and you can't get it out. Now, whether or not that's a problem kind of depends on the scenario that you're working in. If that's stuck in the wall forever, does that matter? Sometimes it does just get jammed in and you literally can't get it out, because as soon as you put a screw into that and you start putting force onto the conical section at the end, it immediately makes it start expanding and it forces it to get jammed in the wall again. So yeah, kind of removable, but the back end sometimes gets jammed. Close edge applications, so close to the edge of a wall, is a big no-no for these, because it can cause the brick or block to split, because obviously as it expands, it's putting a considerable amount of force outwards on whatever it's in, and it can easily split a brick or block in half, no problem whatsoever. So yeah, if you're near the edge of a wall, consider using the concrete screws or resin fixings instead. In terms of through fixings, again, doesn't work very well for through fixings, because you really need to drill all your holes and then put this bit into the wall, and then obviously put your bolt through with that already being on the other side. You can technically drill a massive hole in your bit of wood and then just use a great big washer on the end to try and cover it up, but that's not a very good way of doing it, because really you want your threaded portion to be more or less in contact with the wood so it can't move around. But if there's no other option, I guess you could do that, but I don't particularly recommend it. Generally, if you are doing wall bolts, what you're going to have to do, similar to what I said before, what I would do is I would put one end in and then level it out, put the other end in, and then I would have to mark all of the holes individually, take everything down, drill everything, and then pop the back section into all of the holes, and then lift the bit of wood up, probably put one bolt in one end, one in the other, hope that everything still aligns, which often it doesn't. You try drilling a hole with an SDS drill with millimeter accuracy when you're up a ladder, 20mm hole in the cold at the edge of a brick or block, and you move around a little bit. It's very hard to get it perfectly accurate. And that brings me on to another kind of major disadvantage of these, is that what can often happen is once you've got this section in the wall and you lift your massive ledger board up or whatever and you come to insert this in, firstly, sometimes it can be really hard to find the thread in the conical. It's fine when I'm like this, when I'm standing in a garage in a controlled environment. You can find the thread in that, no problem. But it's so easy to accidentally cross-thread it, especially if things haven't lined up perfectly. And trust me, do not cross-thread these. If you cross-thread this, you will not get it back out, because as soon as this gets jammed in the end there, any force that you're putting on in that direction is just making it get jammed in the hole even more. So yeah, you need to be 100% confident when you're tightening this up that you're not cross-threading it. And what can often happen as well in the real world when you're trying to put this in is that little bits of dust, brick dust or concrete dust or whatever, can get jammed in the thread, and again that can cause it to get completely seized up. So from that perspective, that does make them a little bit more tricky to use. My top tip for dealing with that whole situation is to get them all threaded up before you even lift the ledger board into place, if it is a ledger board that you're dealing with. So in other words, you would drill your hole through, you would drill the hole in the brick wall or whatever. I'll sacrifice my perfectly good joist just to show you what I mean. I've completely butchered that, but never mind, you get the general idea. But what I would do is I would poke the threaded section through, shove this on the other side, make sure that we're definitely in the thread, just kind of loosely put it in place like that. And if you imagine, you would have that all the way along and then offer the whole thing up to the wall. You'll normally need someone to hold the ledger for you while you get your hand behind and get each wall bolt in every hole. Gently tap each one home, but not so much that you accidentally break the wall bolt. And then you're finally safe to tighten things up with an impact driver or a wrench of some description. So on a big ledger, things start to get a little bit tricky. And then in terms of unpredictable substrates, these are my fixing of choice. Think Victorian houses, great big TV brackets, great big kind of shelving units and things like that. Providing you're not too close to the edge of a wall, if you accidentally hit a mortar line, you should still get a pretty decent fixing. Then we get on to chemical fixings, so resin fixings. And this particular one, I mean, it's just what I've happened to use for a job. I've got no tie with any manufacturer or anything like that. This particular one, I think, has already been partially used. And if you're really careful with the tip of it, if you don't mix together the two parts at the tip, I mean, this has last been used about a year ago and it's still soft at the end there. So this is still vaguely usable. I think it does technically have a shelf life of about a year. But anyway, the general idea with these, it's a two-part kind of mixture, and when you inject it into the hole, it goes down this tube and it mixes it together. And once that is mixed together, it produces like this plasticky resin compound that once it's hardened, it's unbelievably strong, like almost as strong as the steel itself that is fixed into the resin. The big problem though with chemical fixings and resin anchors is that if you don't fix them correctly and you don't follow the manufacturer's instructions correctly, it will fail. And with this sort of stuff, it tends to be a catastrophic failure. Either it's going to work or it isn't going to work. So in a situation like this where we're using some threaded rod, so this is some M12 threaded rod, this is made by Fisher, you would drill your hole, you would then blow the hole out, and you can use various things to blow the hole out. I've got one of those pump things, but I never find it works particularly well. I found the best thing to blow the dust out of the hole is a compressor with an air gun attachment. And then you should use a brush to brush the hole out and then blow it out again. And basically you have to make sure that there is not a scrap of dust left in the hole. If there is, the resin just doesn't stick to the dust. And what can happen is, as soon as you start tightening the bolt onto the end of your threaded rod, it can come loose. Providing you know what you're doing and you do the job properly and carefully, these give the strongest fixing of all. If you take shortcuts, if you're in a rush, if you don't properly blow the dust out the hole, they will fail. You also need to consider how long you need to leave it for the resin to set as well. With this particular one, it needs 85 minutes setting time at 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. It can be quite messy to work with, so it's best to wear gloves. And the general cost of this is quite high as well. I think one of these tubes is, I wrote on the tube, £12.49. And, you know, you might get lucky with one of these where you manage to chop the top off in such a way that you can recap it and use it at a later date. But on the basis that I'm going to assume that once you've opened it, you're going to use it. And even if there's half the tube left, you're probably going to throw it in the bin. That means if you're just doing 5 fixings or something like that, it is going to work out the most expensive of all of the options at £17.17 for 5 lengths of the threaded rod plus 1 tube of the resin. Pretty self-explanatory, but obviously it's not removable. Once the threaded rod is in the resin and it's set, you ain't going to get that back out. The only way to get rid of it is to cut it off with an angle grinder or something. But then we'll get on to some positives with this. Close edge applications, generally absolutely fine. Through fixings, absolutely fine as well, providing you get all the dust out of the hole. But again, think of that great big ledger board on a wall. Same as before, I would attach one side, make sure it's all level, attach the other side in, drill all of your holes straight through the board, meticulously clear all the dust out, get your resin into all the holes, pop all the threaded rod in. I will make a separate video about this at some point. But yeah, pop all the threaded rod through, make sure you don't get any of the resin on the thread because that's going to scupper things. Let it set. Generally, I prefer to let it set overnight just to be on the safe side, but let it set for as long as possible and then you can like bolt everything up as you would with any other fixing. Obviously, it's not going to work on unpredictable substrates. If you drill through and you've hit a mortar line, forget it. You're going to have to find a different location where you're not hitting a mortar line, because if you're into loose mortar or whatever, the resin's just not going to stick. Obviously, other primary uses of this is when you need to attach rebar into concrete. Resin is pretty much your only option for that. Great for basically any type of threaded rod, and as I say, really good for through fixings. So which one is the strongest? Well, you know, this is something that you need to do a little bit of research into, because all of these can hold such incredible loads that it's probably more than you would ever need. It's certainly more than I can possibly measure on my Test Tuesday rig, which is why I've never tested anything like this. So bear in mind that I weigh 80 kilograms or whatever. My Test Tuesday rig can handle up to 300 kilograms. With each of these, an M10 concrete screw can take a loading of about 20 kilonewtons, which is basically about 2 tons. That's 2,000 kilograms of force, by the way. An M12 wall bolt, you're looking at a maximum loading of about 18.48 kilonewtons, which is about 1.9 tons. And yes, technically the resin fixings are the winner, and an M12 threaded rod into a resin fixing, you're looking at a maximum loading of 33.2 kilonewtons for this particular one, which is best part of 3.4 tons. So yes, technically the resin fixings are the strongest, but at the end of the day, if you need to attach something to the wall that's heavier than 1.8 tons, you're running the risk that the whole wall's going to fall down before the fixing fails. So I'm going to give you my top tip for using each of these in a minute, but I want to just tell you probably the biggest pros and the biggest cons. It's very subjective from my kind of perspective of using these for quite a long time. The biggest pros of the concrete screws. They're fast and very, very strong in a predictable substrate, and they're also great for through fixings. But the downside of the concrete screws is that they're useless in unpredictable substrates. If you hit a mortar line, forget about it. And because of the dust that tends to fall into the hole as you're tightening the fixing up, it can cause them to bottom out, and that can cause various problems. As I say, I've got a whole video coming up about concrete screws, so I'll go into that in a bit more detail in there. Wall bolts are absolutely great for more variable substrates, and once you've got them tightened up properly, there's very, very little risk of failure. But on the downside, as I say, the thread can easily get jammed, the fixing can sometimes fall apart while you're in the middle of using them, and do not use them close to the edge of walls. And then in terms of resin fixings, obviously fantastic for rebar, very, very strong with threaded rod, providing it's used correctly, and fantastic for through fixing as well. But on the downside, it's very easy to mess it up, and if you mess it up, there's a high risk of failure. In terms of my personal top tip for each of these, if I only could give one top tip, with the concrete screws, drill your hole a good bit deeper than you think you're going to need it to be. With wall bolts, if you can, pre-thread the fixing, so try and make sure you've got it threaded correctly before you put the whole thing in the wall. And as I say, with the resin fixings, my top tip is to use a compressor for blowing all the dust out of the hole. Also use a little brush as well. You have got to make sure that that hole is crystal clean at the point you're putting the resin in. So folks, I hope you found that useful. As I say, I will pop a link down in the description to the page on the Gosforth Handyman website where you can have a look at this for reference if you want. If you've got any extra points that you would add to this, if you think I've got anything wrong, please pop that in the comments and I'll make sure I add it onto the article that's on the website. The whole thing is obviously quite subjective, but this is just my experience of using all of these for quite a long time in a lot of different customer scenarios where you've got all sorts of stuff to go onto walls. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff I've had to attach onto walls over the years, from ridiculously heavy old plasma TVs right through to massive network cabinets and all sorts of things. As per usual, a massive thanks to everyone on the member zone for helping to keep this show on the road. The channel is still sponsorship free, nearly up to my 500th video now, and it is sponsorship free because of all you wonderful people supporting the channel over on the member zone. A really special shout out to all of the gold members that are flying up the screen at the moment. You guys are amazing. Gold memberships are locked at the moment, by the way. The names that you see there at the moment, I'm not adding any more because the list was just getting a little bit too long. But I may open that up again in the future, so do watch this space. For now, folks, as I say, if you've got anything else to add to this, please pop it down in the comments below. Look out for the video coming soon where I go into using the concrete fixings in a little bit more detail. For now, folks, as per usual, look after one another, be nice to each other. We shall see you next time. Tatty bye.